Hi, I'm Jason Norris, and this is episode 7 of Podcast Local from On The Go FM. Back in episode 1, I said if you podcast local, you are a storyteller. No matter how you format your show, you are telling the stories of your community. And then I said something like, become a great storyteller. Well, how do you do that? Practice, of course, right? But even before practice comes knowledge of stories and how to communicate with voice and maybe music and sounds. So on this episode, I would like to point you to resources that will help you get better at telling stories. So I'll start by recommending some books and online resources. I'll also share 7 ways to tell the stories of your community. Now, if you've heard this show before, you've heard me mention the Podcast Local On The Go guide. This is that guide in audio form, and it will be yours even without signing up for the email newsletter. And finally, I'll finish this episode with, well, it's a surprise. So let's just leave it at that for now. No, it's not a sales pitch for an online course or consulting or anything like that. It's free. Since we're in a festive time of the year, consider it a gift. A surprise gift that will have to wait until the end of this episode. Meanwhile, support for Podcast Local comes from the Satchel podcast player for Android and iPhone. Satchel makes it easy to discover podcasts produced in your hometown. Learn more at satchelplayer.com. All right, well, one way to get better at telling audio stories is to listen to audio stories. And you can hear them every day on your local public radio station. When I worked at Alabama Public Radio, every day I heard a mix of local and national stories. The way they report the news allows for more in-depth coverage than what you might hear on commercial radio newscasts. And typically, public radio stories are told in a more conversational style. And that's a good thing. That is something that could help you in your local podcast. Now, I think I should point out something here. Sometimes I hear people use NPR and Serial and This American Life as if they're all the same, and that's what public radio is all about. It is not. Ira Glass started a new form of radio storytelling back in the 1990s. And later, other radio stations started pushing the envelope further, experimenting with innovative ways to communicate with audio. But before Ira Glass, and all of this time since, and even now, NPR and local public radio stations have told what we usually refer to as news stories or news reports. They aren't like Serial. They are stories ranging from about 3 minutes to about 10 minutes. They are researched, well-written with advice from copy editors and news producers, and they are recorded and edited, enhanced where appropriate with ambient sound. Rarely do they use music within the story, since music has the power to influence the perception of the story. The radio host, though, might use some interstitial music after a story and then before leading into another story or leading into a sponsor break. But these are the kinds of stories you can hear every day on your local public radio station. And if you pay close attention, you'll start to observe how they are constructing their stories. You could even make that a personal project. Record or download a few stories that you like and write out a transcript for it. Look at how they put the words together to tell that story. Also, look for the underlying structure. So, that is the first resource. Listen to and examine closely both the national stories and the local stories that are told on your local public radio station. The second resource goes along with that. It's a book called Sound Reporting, The NPR Guide to Audio Journalism and Production by Jonathan Kern. There is instruction on, for instance, how to write for the ear. That is, with broadcasting and podcasting, you're not writing words to be read. You're writing for people who will be listening. And it's a different thing that is sometimes very challenging. There are chapters on editing, both kinds, Not just the technical part of editing a story so it sounds good, but that earlier, pre-production editing when your story is in the writing stage. In fact, the better you get at editing while writing, the easier it will be when you finally get to post-production. There are 18 chapters in this book that will help you become a better local podcaster. Again, that's Sound Reporting, the NPR Guide to Audio Journalism and Production by Jonathan Kern. Another resource is a graphic novel. Literally, it's a graphic novel drawn by Jessica Abel. It's called Out on the Wire, Storytelling Secrets of the New Masters of Radio. The kind of storytelling she's talking about is the kind of storytelling you've heard on Serial and This American Life and Radiolab. This goes beyond the usual news reporting style. If you want to learn to tell stories this way, her book is a really great starting point. She also has a podcast where she talks about this way of telling stories. Each main episode covers a particular point, and then there are episodes that follow that. It's a workshop episode where people have been practicing the assignments she gives and talks about those. And there's also a Google Plus community where people can meet others learning this style of reporting and storytelling. Now, music is something that can enhance local podcasts and storytelling in general, and I talked more about this in episode 6 of Podcast Local, so check that out for 3 ways to approach music. If you want to learn more about using music in your podcasts, go read the articles at transom.org. There are several that focus on both the art and the skill of using music. Now, I didn't mention this in episode 6, but there was one piece of music advice that I accepted and tried right away, and I have used this technique maybe 95% of the time since then. So here's how I used to do it. When I was approaching the end of a segment or the end of an episode, I would slowly fade the music in as I was talking. Like this. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, of course. But one of the articles suggested a more effective way was to forget the fade and simply start the music at a particular point. Don't fade it in just anywhere. Start the music at a place that will actually help move the story along. For example, start the music when you say something new or dramatic, or when you switch from one topic or another. The key takeaway from that article was don't fade, and I agree, it is more effective most of the time. However, there is that 5% of the time when I ignore that rule because it makes more sense to fade. But at least I feel better about my reason for choosing to fade, rather than just fading because habit. Those articles on music are at transom.org. Just search the term using music to discover them. Now, this last resource I'll recommend is NPR's editorial training site, Hone Your Craft on Air and Online. It's primarily designed for people who work at NPR member stations, but it's open to local podcasters too, and it's free. And I guarantee you will find some actionable advice on that site. You might even find something there today that helps you improve your very next episode. The best page, I think, to start with is their Learn the Basics page, and I'll provide a link to that in the show notes for this episode, episode 7 of Podcast Local. Or you can also explore their other articles. They've got things on audio and digital, social, and visual. That's all at training.npr.org. So what resources have helped you improve your craft? Please share those with me so I can get better, but I can also share them with other local podcasters too. Contact me at podcastlocal.com. I want to take a moment to thank Bo York and the team that created the Satchel podcast player for sponsoring Podcast Local. It's a good fit. The podcast is about local podcasts and podcasters. And the Satchel Player has a feature that makes it easy for listeners to discover local podcasts in their area. And it benefits you when someone in your community clicks that local button and discovers your podcast. To make sure that happens, go to satchelplayer.com and register your show for free. Oh, and download the Satchel Player for yourself and give it a try. You'll discover other cool features like that donate button. Listeners could send you money while they're listening to your show. In fact, that's a good reason to recommend the Satchel Player to your listeners, too. The app is free. It works on an iPhone and an Android phone. You can get it and register your show at satchelplayer.com. Sometimes we get stuck. Writer's block, or podcaster's block, whatever you want to call it. Sometimes we simply need a spark to get new ideas. One way I've been helping local podcasters is with an on-the-go guide. The term on-the-go is in reference to our network, onthego.fm. But anyway, one of those guides is called Podcast Local, 7 Ways to Tell the Stories of Your Community. I've been offering it as a free resource to encourage you to sign up for our email newsletter, the On the Go FM update. Well, on this episode, I just decided to share those 7 ways with you, whether you sign up or not. I want to help you tell the stories of your community, and I know many of you will find something on this list that will spark new ideas for your local show. Even if you haven't started a local podcast yet, 1 or 2 of these ideas might be the thing that gets you going. These 7 ways to tell the stories of your community will work whether you're podcasting for your state, county, parish, city, neighborhood, local sports team, or even your local church. The first way you can podcast local is by telling the stories of local places. Talk about parks, museums, historical sites, and locally owned restaurants and businesses. Explore your community, share your discoveries. It's one of the easiest ways to get started. Visit those places, talk about what you see, do a little research to find the story behind those places, and maybe even talk with people at those places to find out what they know and what they like about those places. The second way to podcast local is to tell the stories of local people. Talk to people, listen to their stories, share what they've seen and heard and experienced. Certainly talk with well-known people in your community, but don't overlook the often overlooked. They've got stories too. Of course, all of this requires more effort because you have to actually get out there and ask people to record a conversation with you. And usually you should do some preparation too. Have a handful of great questions that you want to ask them. And then, of course, you have to let them talk. You're highlighting them and their experiences in your community. So listen carefully and ask follow-up questions to draw them out. The third way to podcast local is to talk about local history. Tell stories of the past. When was your community created? Who did it? Why did they name it that? Why is that historical site so significant? Is there anything on the National Register of Historic Places? Find out what and tell why. I talked about history on episode 4 of Podcast Local. If you like discovering stories from the past, check out that episode for more ideas on how to do that. Now, the fourth way that you can podcast local is by talking about local events. Talk sports, concerts, carnivals, theater, festivals, and parades. Talk to the people who attend the events, and also talk to the people who make it all happen. By the way, I went to the Podcast Dallas meetup this week, and I met a local podcaster. Deborah Grumbach has a show called Around Plano, and she does a lot of research on activities and events that are taking place in and around Plano, Texas, and North Dallas. You could become the go-to resource for what's happening by talking about local events in your local podcast. You can also podcast local by sharing local opinions. Ask people anything, local, national, or global issues, both serious and silly. What makes it local? You're discovering what people in your community think about issues. Back in the day, this was called man-on-the-street interviews. And there's another term for this kind of thing, vox pop. It's Latin, and it means the voice of the people. Well, whatever you call it, go out there and find out what your community thinks about things. Another way to podcast local is to focus on local government. Talk to the people who serve your community, administratively and politically. Now, it's your podcast, so it's your choice whether you make it a partisan or unbiased show. You know, you could actually highlight the good things going on in your local government too. But whatever you do, count the cost before choosing. And finally, you can podcast local by making a show about local reviews. Review new menu items, offer your thoughts on local theater productions or books by local authors. But think carefully before becoming a critic. Consider the impact of your words. Do you want to become the critical voice in your community? Or is there another way to review that's encouraging? Again, it's your show. It's your choice. Just count the cost before choosing. And actually, that advice about considering the impact of your words, it really applies to all 7 of these ways that you can tell the stories of your community. But there you have it, the audio version of the Podcast Local On the Go Guide, and you didn't even have to sign up for the newsletter. But if you would like to have those 7 ways in a handy physical guide to stick on your refrigerator, well, you can get a PDF copy by signing up for the On the Go FM update. That's the email newsletter for our network, and you can find out more at podcastlocal.com. Okay, well, now it's time for that surprise. I want to offer you another resource for ideas, insights, and even advice. And that resource is me. Now, there are 2 things about me that can be helpful to you. First, I really want to help you. I want to help you podcast local. I like helping, and I have experience doing these things, and I love talking about podcasting. Second, I like exploring ideas. I took that StrengthsFinder assessment a while back, and my number 1 strength is ideation. With me, ideas just happen all the time on any subject. Every subject. Ideas, they're like popcorn, or maybe more accurately, they're like fireworks. They're just popping all the time. I generally, though, prefer to focus my ideation in a few particular directions. Like the tagline on our On the Go FM network says, exploring innovative ways to create, educate, and communicate. So when I'm saying that I'm offering myself as a resource, I'm not saying if you talk with me, I'll make your show the most popular and most financially successful local podcast that has ever been. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is if you talk with me, I'll listen to what you're trying to accomplish. I'll be a sounding board, and then I'll give you some ideas to explore. So it's like coaching or consulting, but it's with a primary focus on generating ideas that you can then run with. And this is a gift. It's free. Who knows? One day I might try professional coaching in this way, but that day is not today. I want to explore ideas with you to help you connect with your community. So, do you already have a local podcast? What might make it better? Do you have anything that you would like to do, but you're having trouble articulating it? Talk to me. Or are you just thinking about starting something, but you haven't yet? A local podcast? A community radio station? Is it nagging at your mind, but you're just not sure where to start? talk to me. I love exploring ideas and brainstorming possibilities. So I'm offering myself as a resource for ideas. Contact me at podcastlocal.com. I'm Jason Norris, and I look forward to talking with you. Thanks for listening to Podcast Local from On The Go FM.